Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I am joined today by Stephen Petroni, who is the chairman of FESAC, and I normally like to keep this channel free of politics, and in fact, actually, I think we're going to keep this entirely free of politics today. But what we are going to talk about is what can be done to ensure, to maintain the possibility of collecting firearms in Europe. I think first off, we have a lot of European viewers, and I think this is an important subject to bring up. And within the American audience for the channel, I think it's important for us to realize that we are not immune from what happens in Europe. And Europe is not immune from what happens in the United States. And as small arms collectors, we really need to understand what's happening in other places and work with, or at least maintain a good up-to-date knowledge of what's happening in other places. Because something that starts in Europe can easily come to the United States, and perhaps vice versa. So, FESAC, what is FESAC?
It's the Foundation for European Societies of Arms Collectors. So basically, all the individual organizations within European countries can be affiliated with FESAC. Then we have what we call national delegates who will present the position country by country. And then FESAC formulates the policy and strategy how to protect these organizations and their members from any legislation that could endanger their activity.
Okay. So in Europe, you have a lot of small arms collectors organizations.
Yes, we do.
That's something we don't have so much in the United States, but it really is a foundational thing over here in Europe. So
yes, we do. Actually, Ian, I would put it this way. If you had to ask me what is FESAC's objective, I would say that its mission is to protect the mission of the individual collector. And what is the mission of an individual collector? At face value, it is the accumulation of a collection. It's acquiring items, but it is also the mission of acquiring, conserving, and researching firearms. And this is something that we want to do to pass on to posterity.
Absolutely.
In actual fact, there is no difference between an individual collector who carries out his, let's call them duties, diligently, and the museum curator. It's the same road. The only difference is we have to pay for it.
And I think if you look at the literature out there, the firearms reference books, the vast majority are written by private individual collectors and not published by museums.
That is entirely correct. That is entirely correct. And in fact, you will notice that even in your travels and meeting collectors, so many collectors are specialized on a particular topic, something which museums may not have the opportunity to do. And museums have a lot to learn from individual collectors, and you can see it in the books that are published. That is a fact.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think if FESAC's mission is to protect European small arms collectors from legislation, a lot of people would probably look at the recent 2015 to still evolving changes in EU directives and say, well, obviously you haven't done a very good job. What has FESAC's impact or role been regarding these changes?
Well, let's start from FESAC's work within the European Union, because we are focused mainly on what is happening in the European Union. We have already been involved in the changes which were finalized in 2008, which weren't bad. We started from a situation where the original directive, the 1991 directive, is intended to facilitate the activity. It is not a restriction of the activity. However, that has been misinterpreted by many countries. And I do admit that in spite of the fact that there is a European Union, there is a directive, the variance in national legislation can be quite extreme. You can have a very, let's say, relaxed attitude in one country and a very severe, very restrictive attitude in another. Our objective is to protect at European level first. Because if we protect at European level, at least we've established a safe minimum standard per country. Then it's up to the national governments, obviously, to implement it in the proper way. So if you take the last case as an example, and I'm sure American collectors would not be aware of this entirely. First of all, there are many countries in Europe where you can collect automatic firearms in full working order. And obviously, if you can collect full automatic firearms, you can also collect semi-automatics, repeating firearms, whatever. what happened on the 18th of November 2015 was that the European Commission, published a proposal in the wake of the terrorist attacks in Paris, barely 5 days later, which basically, it was a draft law to ban automatic firearms in private hands. That means that every automatic firearm currently in collections would have been collected and destroyed, confiscated rather.
Okay.
Museums, national museums, would have had to deactivate the automatic firearms in their collections.
Okay.
Now, you appreciate that if you have a museum that is meant to study automatic firearms, they can't study an automatic firearm if it's a lump of steel that's welded together.
In particular, considering reserve collections, it's
Absolutely.
one thing if an artifact is permanently in a little glass cabinet, but the vast majority of collections in museums are located in the vault, in the reserve, and they're fully functional guns, and they're usually the weird versions. They're the things that people want to study.
Precisely. And it is those reserve collections that authors and researchers will have to access to be able to write their books. So once you close that possibility, then you can't do proper research.
It is, in fact, those reserve collections that have led to many of the videos on this channel.
Yeah, I'm pleased to say. Also, they wanted to freeze museum collections, which means if a collection had X number of automatic firearms, they couldn't add a rare piece to their collection.
Okay.
So the whole proposal was absolutely insane. And the destruction that would have brought upon European collectors and historical artifacts it's simply immeasurable. You can't measure the extent of the damage because you don't know how many good pieces there are out there.
Right.
And this was a very serious attack. There were other factors which affected sports, which I won't go into today, but this is basically where we sprung into action.
Okay.
And although I was very upset at the manner in which the Commission published this proposal, I also appreciated the fact that it was such a drastic action and the strategy on their part was so incorrect that they motivated all individual groups to come together and work together. So
Okay.
for the first time in Europe, we had the hunters, the sport shooters, the trade, industry, collectors, everybody working together to push back this directive.
And even museums.
And museums. We were in the European Parliament. I attended several public consultations, public meetings in the European Parliament, and I had museum people sitting at my side, and we were basically we were delivering the same message, which was if you want to control crime and terrorism, you do not deactivate the guns in museums, and you do not confiscate the guns that are being held by collectors that are, collecting according to the rules. Simply does not hold any water. Anyway, we fought it tooth and nail. It was a very, very long process, and the administrative structure and legislative structure in the European Union is very complex. And I'm sure a lot of Americans would be quite confused if I had to explain how it works.
Yeah, let's
so
not
basically you have three bodies, which is the Commission,
Okay.
you have the European Parliament, and you have the Council. So we fought this mainly within the European Parliament, because in the European Parliament sit individuals who are elected by European citizens. So they were our voice. The people we could approach were those people. The Commission simply didn't want to listen. I am confident that they weren't even interested in achieving a result. My impression, and this was confirmed by a statement made by one of the officials, is they simply wanted to show that they're doing something. So the whole concept was flawed.
Yeah.
And anyway, we attacked it on these merits. We managed to push back all these bans which we were proposing. And what eventually was published in July was a new directive, a fresh directive, which did not include the bans on automatics. So every country can still issue licenses to collectors for automatic firearms. Museums can still carry on collecting, preserving automatic firearms in full working order.
Okay.
Their collections are not frozen. So yes, in that respect, it was a huge success.
Okay. Despite the fact that there are still problems with
There are still problems
there's a
because
lot less than what there would have been.
yeah, but what happened there was that once everybody's battle position was fixed, and this is what we wanted, that is what the Commission wanted. I get the feeling, I get the impression, which is quite accurate, I must say, that they just wanted to make sure that they did take something away, because otherwise the whole thing would have fallen flat on its face. So we got useless restrictions on magazines, for instance, magazine capacity, which don't really affect collectors.
Okay.
But, however, they do affect collectors of militaria. Let's say a fellow who has a mannequin with a deactivated gun, and the deactivated gun is no problem. But the magazine in that deactivated gun is now a problem in some countries, because they would have to get a license for that magazine. But again, Ian, this is not in all countries. I am very pleased to say that a number of countries that I have been working with have taken a stance whereby they want to introduce this directive as a bare minimum with the least possible disruption to collectors and other enthusiasts. So there is a willingness to keep all these dangers at bay. Then there are other countries that are taking the opportunity, using the directive, to enforce restrictions that have been on their wish list for years.
Okay.
So they see it now as an excuse to introduce these. And it is in our interest, obviously, and we encourage our members to fight this off in their respective countries.
Right, but FESAC focuses on the EU. I think the analogy for us would be the federal government versus the states.
Correct. However, we do assist national organizations in their respective countries.
Okay.
So where now there are countries that are introducing a collector license for the first time, we are there to provide them with our know-how, with our experience. We have some very, very good models in national legislation.
Okay.
We know it works, so it's not something which is just a theory. It's something that has been working for a number of years.
Okay.
And we give that as an example for other countries to follow.
I think there are a lot of Americans who will see this and think the idea of having to get a license just to own a collectible firearm is absurd. However, I want to point out to everyone that in Europe, generally you're starting from a position, they don't have a Second Amendment built into the national foundation of government the way we do. And so they're starting from a position that is much less robust. And the way that you acquire these rights is slowly and incrementally. And going from very little to demanding the equivalent of what we have in the United States is something that's simply not feasible.
Exactly.
And if you look at how gun rights have evolved in the United States, it's also not an overnight paradigm shift. It is slowly and incrementally, one state will adopt a new regulation or remove a regulation. We saw this with our concealed carry permits.
Exactly.
We're seeing it now with constitutional carry. And when it's seen to not be a problem, look, we did it in this one state and it didn't cause any trouble. And then a second state does it, and then a third. And eventually it becomes a trend. And I think there's really a possibility for that same sort of thing to happen in Europe. And it's groups like FESAC that can make that possible.
Absolutely.
By helping European organizations collaborate together.
However, Ian, I'll go back to what you said initially. And that is that American collectors should be very well aware of what's going on in other countries, and in Europe especially. That is the underlying message in this conversation, I would say, because no one is an island. And if we don't network, if we don't have a very effective network that includes American collectors, European collectors, we cannot learn from experiences like this. So this is my message at the end of the day. Let us make sure that we don't have an isolationist view of collecting. Collecting is on a world level.
Yes.
So the laws and the regulations may vary. The conditions in the US aren't the ones in Europe. There are some instances when what we have in Europe is better than what there is in the US. And there are cases, obviously, when what's in the US is better than it's here. Our mission to collect, to preserve items for posterity is a very noble mission.
I agree.
And there is absolutely nothing under the sun that would stop me from repeating this message over and over again, even to people who are totally against this subject, because I firmly believe in it. And if we don't do what we're doing, then future generations will not have the opportunity
Right.
to view weapons and firearms similar to the ones that you've put on your videos. And by the way, Ian, apart from all this, because you've said what we've managed to do, I must thank you on behalf of FESAC for what you're doing, because your videos, you're putting rare firearms on a table, talking about them, taking them to the range, explaining to people what it's all about. That is part of this noble mission.
Well, thank you.
So, Ian,
I appreciate it.
well done.
Thank you. So for the European folks who are watching, what would you ask them to do? What can they do if they want to be more involved?
What's important is that they follow what is going on. If we were collecting stamps, they could go and live on an island and not need to communicate with anybody. But we are collecting firearms, and it's a sensitive topic, and it requires that a collector keeps abreast of what's going on. Therefore, we are totally open. We are totally open to people who'd like to have information. We are totally open to help and keeping together, and especially working together and giving the right message to people who may not appreciate what we're doing.
Okay.
If you speak to someone who may not be interested in firearms, I am pretty sure that that person would nevertheless still be interested in making sure that the artifacts, historical artifacts, are conserved.
Right.
So work on that subject. It's very important that people understand that the role of a collector is precisely that. And if we endanger that role, then we're going to have serious problems in the future.
Yeah. And I would say to the Americans who are watching, it's worth knowing what's happening in Europe. And we have the internet today. We have a tool by which we can communicate instantaneously across the entire globe. And there is absolutely no reason that you can't talk to collectors who are here in Europe, in Asia, anywhere on the planet. And I would say, get to know some of those people. They have guns that we don't. We have guns that they don't. We can learn a lot from more collaboration between different countries. And at the same time, we can also further the goals of enhancing people's ability to collect these firearms. So hopefully you can get something useful out of this. Hopefully we'll see some collaboration. And I'd love to see FESAC have more success going into the future.
Thank you, Ian.
And continue the mission. It's a noble job.
Thanks once again.
Thank you. Thanks for watching.